In America, the early 20th century was a time of vast innovation and transformation. The days of living in a rural town on a ranch or farm were coming to an end, as the vast majority of the U.S. population and immigrants were driven into cities to work industrial jobs. This would create a new environment where people had to depend on others for producing goods that were formerly just made by themselves, such as clothes and tools, but most importantly, the very thing that gives us the energy in order to survive: food. The food production industry would take over the job of feeding the masses. This is different from producing something like a tool. Worst case scenario with a low quality tool is it breaks and you have to get a new one. With low quality food, you end up with poison in your bloodstream, your gums get cut up, and on top of all that, you just ate a grinded up human. This means there's a lot of responsibility for the owners of food companies to put out a quality product that's made ethically and clean. But this never happens, especially in the early 20th century. The tragedy of the meat industry and how horribly it treated its workers would go unnoticed for decades, until one man would bring attention to it all across the country.
Before the Industrial Revolution, the meatpacking industry was very localized, with many people producing their own food. Those who bought would go to their local market and purchase fresh meat from their local farms. With the growth of cities and population, along with the Industrial Revolution creating opportunity for more efficient and profitable meat, the production of old market systems would die out like most other local industries. In the late 1800s, entrepreneurs would create a large, unregulated meatpacking industry, which would give rise to some new problems.
On February 26, 1906, Upton Sinclair, an avid socialist, published The Jungle. It was originally written as a socialist piece to show how workers were suffering in the meat industry and, by extension, capitalist society. Instead, most people paid attention to the disgusting and riveting truths about the meat industry that Sinclair observed, such as people's body parts, like fingers, being put into meat, and beef carrying diseases like tuberculosis. This would cause mass panic and discussion about the sanitary practices of the industry, leading to regulation.
The tragedy of this time was the lack of sanitary working conditions and the government's laissez-faire approach to businesses. The meatpacking industry would release many diseased and, in general, disgusting products to the public because of the unsanitary working conditions at hand. An example of these issues was the diseased meat. While it was known that tuberculosis could reside in meat, inspectors before reforms had been paid off by the meatpacking industries to allow diseased meat to be shipped out. The workers were some of the biggest victims, as each job would have its own set of ailments. This could include butchers cutting off their hands or wearing their thumbs out to the point they were stumps. People who worked in the tank rooms were also known to fall into vats and then come out the other side in a can of meat ready to be shipped out. Many suffered under this industry, making it very ripe for reform and improvement. As these horrors were happening, the government involvement was close to nothing. In other words, our government still had a laissez-faire approach to businesses. Towards the end of the Gilded Age, there were still many big businesses that had no government involvement and in which no regulation to working conditions. This lack of government led to these horrific events.
The jungle opened people's eyes as to what was going on in the meatpacking industry and how truly unsanitary and how dangerous the products really were that people consumed, So, because of the sudden enlightenment, the public started to call in safety measures to be put into place so that everyone knew that they could consume good products again. So, hence the beginning of the turn from tragedy to triumph.
The tragedy of the meatpacking industry, with the help of Sinclair's book, began to look brighter. With the immense pressure from the public, now fully aware of the disgusting truth behind what they were eating, the government could no longer look past it. The end of the laissez-faire approach to regulation of businesses, which was a trademark of the Gilded Age, was over now, and everybody was adamant for change. This time became known as the Pure Food Movement.
The horrors that came from the meatpacking industry was the cause of the many reforms and government involvement in businesses. These reforms were the triumph of the early 20th century. The Food and Drug Act of 1906 was the first of many reforms and regulations towards the protection not only of the workers, but of the many consumers of the United States and foreign countries. This reform regulated the sale and creation of food and drugs that were adulterated, misbranded, or poisonous. Many more reforms were to come, like the Meat Inspection Act, which incriminated any industry that sold adulterated or misbranded meat. The Hepburn Act, which stopped free passes of meat industries being able to put uninspected meat onto trains. The Gould Amendment of 1913, which enforced the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1913, in that it was required for any food to plainly mark on the outside of the package in terms of weight, measure, numerical count, and ingredients. All of these regulations improved the meatpacking industry and was the reason we can call the 20th century triumphant. As there were many mistakes made with no regulation of the meatpacking industry and the destruction of the community, the government finally stepped in and was ready to make a great change to the society. Due to the regulations passed in the 20th century, we're able to look back and see just how far we've come.